I'm now going to show you how you can create a custom CloudFront that's going to be a lot more versatile and a lot better than the CloudFront default or preset that comes with Vue. So using the Start Scene 1 from the content provided with the training, what we can do is go to Atmosphere and we're going to add a cloud layer. Now we are going to start with the threatening CloudFront, and basically what this is, if we take a look and find the CloudFront, it's just a very simple function that uses primarily the detail in order to create the look of the cloud. It uses a noise node, I believe the step. We'll go ahead and take a look at the density in just a second, but it does have some drawbacks because of the way it's set up. So there are some much better ways to create CloudFronts. So we'll go ahead and take a look at that. If we remove the detail amount and the altitude variations, we'll really see exactly what it is made of, which is just basically a straight line all the way across the scene. But the actual altitude, even though it's set to 8 kilometers, it's not really filled in all the way, so it does make it difficult to work with or customize. So what I want to do is set the scale to 1, and we are going to edit the material, change the function scale all the way to 1, edit the function, and it's using a step along with a rotation and twist in order to create this effect. Now, depending on the Z origin that's used, it will move through this function, and the step is really more of a kind of blocks. There is a much better way, and it will also render a bit faster, a lot less calculation, and give you a lot more customized options. So what we can do is just delete the function that's in there. You could also right-click and reset the function from the Cloud Material Editor. And we're going to add a math node vector operation, go to Composer 3. Or actually, we're going to use Decomposer 3. And we're going to take the position vector, connect it to the Decomposer 3, and now we have an X, Y, and Z. Well, we can use the X, Y, and Z to produce a number output to create a CloudFront. So if we connect it to the X, we're going to get that same sort of a setup, where it's just a straight line moving across the scene. Now this is reversed from the other direction, so you could use the opposite in order to get it to work in the other direction. Still with no detail, but it's a lot fuller, and it's going to definitely fill it up a lot more. But we can start to bring in the detail amount, and then bring back some of the altitude variation. And this will be a faster processing CloudFront and a little easier to work with now if we want to change it. So if we want further modification, because right now most of the shape is being created by that detail layer, which means we can't get the finer details we would normally get from that detail, and we are very limited by the percentage that we can use. So let's take down the scaling, edit the material, bring down the scaling of that detail layer, and that's going to create a much more uniform looking cloud. So now we need to rely on the density production in order to make it look more interesting. So we're going to edit the material, go back into the function, and what I want to do is start bringing in the other vectors. So I'm going to add in a blender node, select the connection between the Decomposer 3 and the density, and we can connect the input 1 and the available blender to the y-axis. So this will allow us to break it up a little bit more. Without a filter in between, we're not going to see much. So what we need to do is add a filter in between the Y connection and the blender. and one that's going to work pretty good, absolute wave. And what we can do is create some areas that will kind of expand outward. And then the way we blend it, we could use pretty much any of the options. Even multiply could be fairly interesting as a subtractor. Because these values are going way above 1, which is the standard output, they're just being clipped. We can really use anything. Blend works pretty good because then you can just kind of blend in between. So if we wanted very defined lines kind of spread out, we could just use a higher amount. But if we want something a little less obvious, we can just kind of reduce the blend amount. So I could also reduce the height. And let's go ahead and just take a look at the current function. So you can see it's a lot more interesting, and the more we break up and define the other axes, the more detail and customization we can do. Right now it's going to be pretty straightforward. It's going to stay very consistent throughout because the vector itself is a very finite amount. If we wanted to break this up a little bit more, we could adjust the blend ratio with the Z, which creates a fairly interesting look, although we may have to connect another one of these filters in order to define it a little bit better. So we'll increase the contrast a little. And now we can adjust the blend with the Z-axis and how the X and Y are going to create the layer. So you can see it kind of dips and curves a little bit more throughout the cloud front. Instead of using the axis to control this, or if we wanted to mix the axis with something else, we could also use a noise node, which is still going to be a very simple function. But we have a lot more control overall for the CloudFront setting it up this way. So I'm just going to delete the connection to the ratio with the Z and add in a noise node. And now we can use that to control this separation or the blend between these two separate functions. We could also turn that into a fractal if we wanted a little more detail. Increase the gain amount if you really wanted to break it up. And just kind of adjust the feature size. It will reach a point where it is going to be removing a lot of the function, depending on the scale value I've set up, because some of these sections are really being removed. We can also see that in the opposite section, outside of CloudFront, it is going to bring in some more clouds. And that has to do with the blending mode. So we can clip out some of those values. I just wanted to show you that there are other ways to kind of mix this together. If we go back and edit the cloud layer, I'm going to take the altitude and bring it down to 1 kilometer, so we can lift up the height a little bit more and see more of the function. Go back, and right now it's set to blend. If we wanted to multiply it, we could see more of an increase in the subtractive area. If we subtract, we're going to see much more of just the X and Y in the defined area we originally set up. So we could also add a little bit of metascale and some rotation, and then get a more interesting looking cloud layer. And we can add a little more detail. And because it is a fractal, it's going to take a little bit longer to render. So if you wanted to stick with noises, now that we have more of the larger scale function set up, we can use the detail to get the finer details, and we wouldn't necessarily need a fractal. From this point, we could also go into the custom cloud layer profiling and then set up a filter in order to cut out specific areas of the front. So if we go back and just remove, let's put this back to add. We could just add in the other axis. Actually, we'll go ahead and blend them. And more of a minimal amount. And we can reduce the size by increasing the contrast. Really to kind of pull more of that out. And blend it less if you want to see less of a reaction. So these functions can also be connected to time if you wanted it to evolve over time and kind of spread out. But there's something else I want to show you too. We're going to add kind of a duplicate layer underneath to create a darker, more of a rain cover. That would be kind of like a fog. So we can add in another copy of the threatening cloud front. And I'm going to set the altitude to 0 and the height to, let's go ahead and do 4 kilometers. We can edit, go into this function, reset it, set the scale to 1 all the way across, and then using the math node vector operation decomposer 3, connect to the X. And we don't need to use the Y connection, although we could. We could just also copy the function from the other layer and bring it over. Right now I'm just going to start with just this overall setting. I do want it to lower down a little further because it is using the exact vector amount, and I don't really want anything 0 and then extending. So what I can do is set up a filter. We could use the offset. So now if we adjust the offset, we can push it in and out. So if it's going to extend in front of the current cloud layer, that's pretty easy to set up with this. So we're just going to start there, reduce the scale a little of that roughness layer. I'm going to decrease the density, go back, edit the material, and change the volumetric color to a much darker color. We're still having a little bit of a problem where it's not quite reaching the ground. So what I can do is switch over to the side view so that we can see the layers. Select the camera and the ground, just holding on the control key, and bring that up slightly. So just moving them on the z-axis, pulling them up, because we cannot move a cloud layer below 0. Overall, this is still a little dense for that new bottom layer. And really, we don't have still the full height set up because we don't have a z output for either of the functions. So if we need to, we might need to add in a little more z-scale. So what we could do is add in the z with another blender to lift that up a little higher. But right now I'm going to go back to the lower layer where we're just going to call it rain. And we could either lift it up, increasing the height. If we wanted to fill in more We could also bring in more of that detail layer, although we probably will need to customize it, changing some of the scales. But I'm going to increase the opacity amount and decrease density, so it's a very light layer, decrease sharpness, increase feathers, and we can decrease the ambient lighting to 0, remove some of those altitude variations. And if we go into edit the material, there's some other settings we can take a look at. Lighting and effects. If we want to force the ambient light color to something different, we could set that up. But it looks like at the moment that should be set up pretty well. We don't need to have cast shadows turned on because it's a very light layer, and it really will help create a fast rendering fog if it's not casting shadows. You could even turn off the internal shadows if you wanted to. Going back to the atmosphere editor, I also want to, under sky fog and haze, turn on projected shadows on clouds, which is going to darken that lower layer. So it's starting to look a little bit better. What I also want to do is take the top layer and the original cloud layer, the threatening cloud front, still called. What we can do is decrease the volumetric color of that cloud layer too to be a little bit darker. And that'll be more of a storm-type cloud. If you want, you can increase the opacity amount, decrease density slightly. We could increase the feathers, make it look a little more interesting. Turn up the shadow density to really darken the layer underneath it. I'm going to turn down the ambient lighting amount. And we can also increase the cover a little further than we were able to with the original threatening cloud front, because the way it's designed, increasing the cover of the original preset, because it's using that step filter, it will start to fill in the opposite area, and you won't really have a front anymore. I do want to go to the rain layer. So select the rain cloud layer, and under the Z-scale we can increase that to 2 and double it. That might extend us a little further on the height, but I'm just looking for a little more stretching, so I'm just going to go ahead and bring that up to 4. And just as long as the height isn't going too high above the layer, at a certain point you will see it raise up above the ground because we don't have that Z-scale set up. So we just kind of need to watch that. It creates a fairly interesting looking cloud layer. Go ahead and move our camera and set up another render. If you need to, you can decrease the detail of that rain layer or get rid of it completely. Even 1% should be alright. And if needed, increase the cover of it in order to fill it in a little bit more. So we'll go to that rain layer and just increase cover to fill it in. If we go to 100, it's really going to fill in the overall layer, and what we could do is go into the function and just take the offset to pull it back a little bit, but still retain the height. Just kind of watching in the preview to see the total subtraction, which is kind of cool. It's a nice way to add another slider and another definable preset. Also take the color, you can make it a lot darker. And what we could also do is go to the ambient light color and set that to almost black to really darken the layer. At this point, if you're noticing too much highlight on the bottom sides of the upper layer, you might need to remove some of the ambient lighting, if not all of it, and then you can decrease the density to kind of blend those together a little bit better. So if we go to that cloud layer, reduce the density, and it does look like the ambient lighting is at 0. So removing the overall density of the layer should help. We can create a lot more of a threatening cloud front than the preset. And if we have to, we can also take that rain layer, lighten it up if it's too dark. You could put it a little more towards a color and start to add some individual saturation. So if we wanted it to be more blue or more green, you can just increase the RGB value. Now, the lower you take the density on these layers, the longer it can take to render because it has to pass more light through the volume, and that could take more time to calculate. So I guess all we really need to do at this point is just to kind of remove some of the saturation from the sky to set up more of a storm-like scene. So we can go over to the sky, fog, and haze and just remove some of that saturation from the sky color and remove some saturation from the decay. And that way we'll end up with a gray sky. If we need to take the sunlight, and we can move that around. Now, the more you change the sun color, we can see a huge difference in the clouds because of the color between the two different layers. So if you need to create more of a blend, you might need to duplicate the two layers and just drop down the altitude, adjust density, rather than creating an entirely custom function. There's a lot of different ways to use these different cloud layers and create a pretty nice effect. If we go back to the rain layer, I can take density and really bring it down to about 1% to create a very light amount of fog. And then removing sharpness, and if we match the color, it might blend a little better as well. So let's just go ahead, go to the atmosphere editor, select the color, copy it from the cloud front, go into the rain, paste it, and it should blend a little bit better this way. So if we wanted to animate these layers moving, the best thing to do would be to change the velocity of material origin to be the opposite of whichever vector you were using to produce the layer. So since we're using the X vector to produce the cloud front, we would want to change the velocity of material origin and set that onto a Y. And that way it'll move along the Y-axis, and you'll be able to move the cloud front. And you would want to set that up equal for the rain and the cloud front layer. And then the detail layer will also move with that to evolve the clouds. If you want to set up a rate of change, it will move that detail layer. So a little bit of a better way to create a cloud front. Certainly with a lot more customization, and you don't need to worry about some of the problems with the other layer. I did want to show you really quick. If we just turn off those layers and turn on the threatening cloud front, because of the way the density is set up, increasing the cover amount, it does seem to be expanding okay at this point. Really depending on the values you're using for the detail, you can sometimes lose way too much of the layer. So it is nice to have the other setup that I just showed you. And I'll go ahead and save this out as CloudFront, and that way you can load it in, take a look at it.